So welcome to Open Source D&D. Open Source D&D. So my name is Michael Whitwer. I'm a RPG historian and an author, for lack of a better term, I guess. And I got to tell you, I was thrilled when Peter asked me to do this panel for a lot of reasons. When I thought about the OGL, the Open Game License, I thought, wow, that is a really important topic. I get to sit here with really legends in the industry that made this stuff happen. And then I got very daunted because it occurred to me this is a really complex topic, and a very nuanced topic. So I'm really glad to be sitting here with people that know what this is all about. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and go down the line here and let these gentlemen. Oh, Mr. Nephew, welcome.
There he is.
Hello, John.
Yes, thank you very much.
Good entrance, good entrance.
Perfect timing.
You need your own theme music.
So I'd like
Spicoli?
I'd like to let each of these gentlemen go ahead and introduce themselves just as a brief intro, and then we'll hit the ground running and get into this topic a little bit. So please, John, if you would start.
Hi, I'm John Zinser. I am the owner of Alderac Entertainment Group. The D20 product that we published we're probably most known for is the world's largest dungeon.
I'm Ryan Dancey. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Alderac Entertainment Group. I'm responsible for maneuvering the open gaming license through the politics at Wizards of the Coast. At the time, I was the Vice President of Role-Playing Games and the Brand Manager for Dungeons & Dragons, and I was responsible for helping get the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons launched.
I'm Eric Mona. I am the Publisher and Chief Creative Officer at Paizo. We make the Pathfinder role-playing game, which in and of itself is sort of a child of the D20 system. I edited Polyhedron magazine at the time, was kind of a D20 magazine, so I was kind of a journalist on the scene, doing product reviews and getting all of the products and reading all the products for the first couple of years. And I also, as a freelancer, edited the 1st edition of Mutants and Masterminds, which was one of the first standalone OGL games.
Hi, I'm Monte Cook. I was on the 3rd edition design team for D&D, on which the OGL was based. I pretty soon after working for Wizards, I left and started my own company, Melhavik Press, where we published pretty much exclusively D20 products using the OGL. And now I am the owner and creative director at Monte Cook Games.
I'm John Nephew. I'm the president of Atlas Games, and we were one of the early adopters of the using the OGL and the D20 system. We had the first product under the Open Game License available for sale at Gen Con when 3rd edition debuted, only because Green Ronin's Death in Freeport was misplaced for a few hours at the hotel. and we had driven down from the Twin Cities with a combination of covers we had printed some weeks earlier and booklets that we had done at Kinko's the night before to stick inside of the color covers to have something at Gen Con.
Thank you very much. So as moderator today, really my job is to get out of the way and let these gentlemen talk, and that's what I intend to do. One thing that occurred to me, I was talking to Ryan a little bit earlier, you know, I've gone to so many lectures in the past where people get right into the how and the why. They don't explain the what. And because I find at least the Open Game License, and specifically how the D20 trademark fits into that, just a little bit complex, I'm going to ask any of you to go ahead and chime in if you can give us at least a really good, solid layman definition of what the Open Game License is, as well as how the D20 fits in.
I don't think anyone's going to...
Yeah, it's kind of Ryan.
We're not going to bother trying to take this one from Ryan.
We originally wanted to have one license. We thought that it would be easiest to have a single thing that we were promoting to the industry and trying to get people to understand.
To bind them in the darkness.
That's right, you can bind them. But it became obvious as we were working on that project that the complexity of trademark law and the complexity of copyright law were, in some cases, working at cross purposes to each other. And so we decided there had to be 2 licenses, one for the copyrights and one for the trademarks. At the time, inside Wizards of the Coast, we had an excellent legal team, and in this case, Brian Lewis, who's in the audience, was responsible for drafting the actual legal text of the licenses. There are unique things in U.S. copyright law. There is a whole field of copyright licenses that are embedded in the copyright law, and we were working on the shoulders of giants because we had all of the software licensing for open software licenses to look at, to use as a model of where we wanted to go. But there really wasn't anything that was like an open trademark license. So Brian had to do a bunch of research and try to figure out how we could use the principles from software licensing for trademarks for software licenses for copyrights for trademark license for games. And that's why there's two licenses. The OGL is the Open Gaming License. The version which is most commonly in use is 1.0A. There was a typo, there was a little mechanical problem in 1.0, and before it was released to the public, we added the fixes to make it 1.0A. And then there's the D20 trademark license. The Open Gaming License, the OGL, is responsible for allowing you to use the rules that other people license with the Open Gaming License. The D20 trademark license allows you to put the little D20 system bug on your book and claim compatibility within a certain carefully subscribed limits with other products that Wizards of the Coast made, specifically with Dungeons & Dragons and the Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monster Manual. By separating those two licenses, we were able to more easily explain to people what we were doing, and we also gave them the opportunity to not just make a bunch of stuff that was compatible with Dungeons & Dragons, but to branch off from the tree of D&D and make any kind of game they wanted to make without having to reference the D20 system if they didn't want to. And the kind of unintended consequence in that is that the Open Gaming License became a generic license, which was then used by several other game systems to license their content. The Fudge system, for example, eventually was migrated to the Open Gaming License, which is where the Fate system comes from, which is still available today. The guys at Big Eyes and Small Mouth, Guardians of Order, they licensed their role-playing game system under the D20, which created a whole another branch. They had a game called Silver Sentinels of the Universe or something.
Silver Age Sentinels.
Yes, yes. So they're instead of just having one tree with a bunch of branches, the OGL turned out to be a whole forest of products. And then the D20 trademark license did what it was supposed to do, which was it allowed people to say, our game is compatible with Dungeons & Dragons without having to go through the massive amount of legal hassle that would have been required to put on your book, our game is compatible with Dungeons & Dragons. It worked great as a iconic way to show that to people without having to actually go down the path of all the necessary legal work. And maybe I should mention the system reference document. The system reference document, the SRD, is not a part of either of the licenses. The system reference document is the distillation of the rules in the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons with all of the canonical intellectual property stripped out. So it doesn't mention any characters, it doesn't mention any gods that aren't in the public domain. There's a bunch of monsters that aren't in it because they were believed to be the proprietary creations of TSR and then Wizards of the Coast. The system reference document was licensed with the Open Gaming License. That creates the first branch in the tree for people to make their own derivative work. So the SRD is kind of the start point when you want to put a new game under the Open Gaming License. And we created that term and then other companies used it. So there's an SRD, there's a system reference document for several different role-playing systems now.
So just for example, we had a role-playing game that was published in 1992 called Over the Edge, which is a very free-form system. And several years ago, we decided to just make a simplified SRD for it and to release that rule system as the warp system. So anybody who wants to can use that. We're actually going to use a completely different system on the 3rd edition of the game that's going to be coming out next year probably. But that's a neat system that was very influential in independent design, and we just wanted to make it clear that it's cool for people to use those elements if they find them useful for stuff that they develop.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So thank you. That's a really great kind of foundation for where I think we can get into the how and the why here a little bit. And Ryan, I'm going to probably worry you out a little bit on the front end of this a little bit. So
okay.
Ryan, I'm going to add John Z to this question here. So from the very beginning, Dungeons & Dragons, TSR had always been very protective of its IP. Downright litigious, really, when dealing with copycats. A lot of people in this room probably are aware. All the way from really mid-'70s when this game came out and on, TSR was always looking at people that were really trying to steal things from them and sending nasty notes and whatnot. So Ryan, when you came in with 5 Rings, you and John, during the TSR acquisition, things obviously were changing quickly here.
Yeah.
Can you briefly bring us through the state of TSR in the RPG industry, the WotC acquisition, and then what in the hell led you to develop this crazy concept, the OGL?
Yeah. So it's hard to remember now, but in the in the end years of the 90s, the role-playing game business was in a death spiral. And I don't just mean TSR, I mean the entire category of role-playing games was really in bad shape. The industry has a trade show. It's GAMA, the Game Manufacturers Association, is the umbrella organization that we all belong to. They have a trade show every year. And in Reno in 1997, a significant portion of the publishers at that show were wearing black armbands to signify that they were there at the death of the industry, if you can believe that or not. TSR had not missed a monthly publication date for a product in probably 20 years. And suddenly in 1997, they started to not ship product, which was the sign that something was really, really wrong in the house of TSR. John and I at the time, we had formed a company called Five Rings Publishing Group to publish Legend of the Five Rings. And we had hired a guy to be our CEO whose name was Bob Abramowitz. And Bob's theory of business was that you run at the cliff as fast as you can, and you hope that by the time you get there, you've created enough capital to build wings so you can fly off, and you don't just fall off the edge of the cliff and die.
And we literally pitched this to our investors. Ryan and I pitched a very sort of narrow, nice, build a game company pitch. And he said, we're just going to run your money towards the cliff, and when we get there, we hope we have wings and we're going to fly. Right? Well, we got to the cliff, and we did not have wings. Yeah. And so
we had little stubs.
We had little stubs. Yeah. Ryan and I had a little. Once we had that thing, we had a little clause in our deal that said, if the wings don't grow, we get L5R back. Yeah. So we were like, well, we're sort of protected against this craziness.
Yeah. Bad things could happen.
And we went in and saw Bob when the wings didn't grow, and Bob said, well, we can't go back to our investors and ask them for more money because the wings didn't grow. Yeah. But we could do something bigger. We could buy TSR.
We can't get more money for Five Rings Publishing, but maybe we could buy TSR. So it turns out, weirdly, that Bob had actually worked for TSR back in the 80s when he was young and starting out. He had been there for 6 weeks for a cup of coffee or something. But he had just enough connection that he was able to get a phone call to Lorraine Williams, who was the owner and CEO of the company. And of course, now in retrospect, we know that her company was dead. It was effectively bankrupt. And so a call out of the blue from a guy, a hustler, saying, I'm going to save your company and get you millions of dollars, was probably the sweetest sound that she heard down that phone line. Contrasting with the angry calls from wholesalers and licensors and warehousers and printers. So we got out there, we took that meeting. Famously, I called John from the parking lot and I said, John, I think we're going to buy TSR because the business was in such awful shape that they had to sell. It was a very, very unique circumstance. Major companies in the United States that have a historical impact on business and have really, really strong brands virtually never fail. It never happens. And the fact that we were there with this very unique opportunity to get into TSR right at the moment of maximum crisis was a very exceptional thing, right? But the business was really not healthy. We turned around, we sold our option to buy TSR to Wizards of the Coast. As a part of that transaction, they also agreed to buy Five Rings Publishing, which bailed our investors out before we got to the cliff, so everybody was happy. And Lorraine sailed off into the sunset and bought a castle, and she lives in Germany. But the business was still broken, right? Fundamentally, the role-playing game business had really ceased to be a viable business. We knew there were lots of people playing, and role-playing was still incredibly popular, but people didn't buy product anymore. They either had all the games they needed, or they weren't excited by what was being offered. They had been burned out by the really big companies, TSR, White Wolf, a bunch of other companies that are gone, putting everything imaginable into the market all the time, so there was just this massive explosion of stuff you could buy. And I went to a meeting at Wizards with a couple of the financial analysts long after the deal had been completed, which I jokingly called the dirty diaper meeting. And they basically said, well, Ryan, here's what you sold us. Massive losses, sales are declining quarter over quarter. The market research data says nobody wants to buy product. Effectively, what are you going to do about it? And Peter turns to me and he says, well, I guess, it's on you, figure it out. And Vince Vince was the chief operating officer at Wizards at the time, very famously says, basically, Ryan, don't fuck it up. He's a very coarse guy, and, you dug us in this hole, you figure out how to dig us out. So my team at Wizards, some of the best people I've ever worked with. They came both from inside the pre-existing TSR structure and some folks that had been at Wizards working on businesses at Wizards before the TSR deal, and a couple of people that we brought back in from outside the company that had left and we thought we could get back in the business. You know, our strategy was 3rd edition has to be the answer. 3rd edition has to be the best version of Dungeons & Dragons that has ever been made, and that the best version that Wizards of the Coast can make. But even that isn't going to be enough. Just making a great new role-playing game isn't going to reboot the market in the kind of dramatic way that needs to be done in order to get this business to turn back into a business and out of this weird dead end that it's fallen into. And one of the things that we discovered in our market research is that the biggest competitor to a new version of Dungeons & Dragons was previous editions of Dungeons & Dragons. People playing 1st edition and 2nd edition of D&D were not likely to switch to a 3rd edition unless we were able to kind of check a lot of boxes, because they had built up these huge libraries of content, or in the case of 1st edition, had gone home ruled off into the wild, you know, iterating on a game system that was 20 years old without any support. And the open gaming license was kind of a Hail Mary pass to say, if we make this thing available so that anybody who wants to can publish their own stuff, a lot of other people who aren't Wizards of the Coast can quickly fill in a lot of the things in the matrix of what people want out of a role-playing game. And switching to 3rd edition isn't going to mean abandoning all this other cool stuff you have. It'll mean switching to a new system and then buying and learning cool stuff that's like the stuff you like, that just isn't going to come from Wizards of the Coast.
I think it's important to say that the back in the purchasing of TSR and stuff, that Peter Atkinson's love for Dungeons and Dragons and his desire
Yes.
to own and buy Dungeons. It was like one of his life goals was to own. His love made this thing happen.
Absolutely.
Made him make a bad deal. Made him put together a team of people, and like he was the glue that made this thing happen when it probably never should have.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and as somebody who was outside of Wizards and TSR, I had some experience with TSR as a freelancer in the late 80s, early 90s, working for them, but had never been in-house. But I had a personal great love for D&D because that's what I had started playing for. That's what I had started my career working on. Something that gave me a great deal of faith and a willingness to jump on to doing stuff with the open game license. When there were a lot of colleagues in the industry who were like, "This, it's a trap!"
It's a trap.
There was some sinister thing, the Mon Calamari were all out in force. But I knew that about Peter. And so first of all, I knew that this was primarily driven by a love of gaming, in a sense that this is a piece of cultural legacy of our tribe as gamers that he was not going to let slip into the night. And moreover, as you guys were talking about the OGL, and as it was just evolving in discussion on industry, private groups and mailing lists and so forth, something that was clear to me was that behind it was a sense of, we have to make sure that this cultural legacy that belongs to all of gamerdom will never slip into the night through the screw up of some random chance or bad decisions on the part of whatever. And that seemed to be a key thing that I said, what they really want here is to allow it to persist, even if Wizards of the Coast fails and vanishes, whatever, that there will be something that clearly says there is material that can go on and be passed along with legitimacy, with blessing, not as a gray market or, something like that, but as this is cool and legit, and it is part of what the whole industry validates and agrees with and has the blessing of the owners.
Well, so speaking of that transition point, so between TSR and Wizards, so nobody represents that probably better than Monte Cook here, who of course was one of TSR's most successful designers, really near the end there. I'm not sure if that it sounds bad, but your stuff, if it was all like your stuff, it would have never happened this way. So obviously, so you lived through both of these things.
I did.
So I guess the questions I would have for you is, I guess I'm really pretty curious, I think we're all pretty curious about what that transition was like from somebody who was on the inside, really a very top designer at TSR, going through the transition to Wizards of the Coast, and then being a key designer on 3rd edition. which of course is the system reference document we're talking about. So even the design considerations, you were tasked with knowing that your game that you were designing was going to be this template document that was going to inspire a bunch of other stuff.
Well, I'm going to answer the last part of that first. Because that isn't the way it happened. Third edition was completely designed, and pencils were down, and Ryan came to us with the OGL. The design team had actually talked about, if we had known that was what was going to happen, and this was suddenly going to be a game engine that is used for more than just Dungeons and Dragons, there's probably things we would have done differently. But that's not the way it happened, and there wasn't time or probably really desire to go back and make those changes at the last moment, just for that, because at that time we still didn't have any idea whether the OGL portion of that prospect was actually going to take off, right? And our mandate was create the best edition of Dungeons and Dragons that you can, and so that's what we did. And the transition though was, well, it's like sort of a Brady Bunch sort of situation where you've got two big families and suddenly forcing them to come together, which means that there were some good parts and there were some bad parts, and because even though Wizards was much younger than TSR, Wizards already had established its company culture and sort of the way that they did things. And like, for example, Wizards of the Coast was very R&D driven. The R&D department was an extremely powerful force in Wizards at that time. And at TSR, it was exactly the opposite. We were just sort of the people put into a room and told to type things. And that's way darker than it needs to be. It's actually really fun. Both companies were really fun to work for. Really great atmospheres. I worked with great people in both places. But it was quite different, right? Wizards was a much more modern corporate kind of culture, and TSR was very old school, 1980s kind of business in a little tiny town in Wisconsin, as opposed to in a big city like Seattle.
Excellent. Oh, thank you. So kind of moving on to now, we're getting into this. We've launched this OGL. We've launched third edition. So Eric, at the time, you're in the almost RPG journalism side of this, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And you're working at you're the publisher of Polyhedron. The editor,
the editor of Polyhedron, which at the time was even so. To go back a little bit earlier, I was brought in like 1999 to be the editor of Polyhedron, essentially, and they were also launching Living Greyhawk, which was part of the big marketing push for third edition. And I had been kind of a Greyhawk fan, written a couple of articles, and was a big kind of online nerd.
Kind of a Greyhawk.
and so anyway, so that was kind of my in there to some degree. And I was just I'd been a lifelong D&D fan, and getting to kind of, get into this place where people whose names I'd been reading my whole life practically were like 3 desks away. It was really an amazing experience, and I just wanted to soak it up. And also I had moved from Minneapolis to Seattle and literally knew nobody, so I didn't even have a phone in my apartment for the first year that I lived there. I just was that guy Laszlo in Real Genius who lives in the cupboard. I was like me at Wizards for the first 6 months, and so I was just fully absorbed in my work. And so every single opportunity I had to learn more about the business, to learn more about my colleagues and stuff, I wanted to take. And I remember, I think the first time I ever heard about the D20 license, and I don't even think it was called the D20. I think it was they were calling it the Dragon license or something. They were just spitballing ideas. They used to do these things called, and this is gonna bring back some memories probably, but they used to do the brand category interface. It was called brand category interface, not the 1980s business, but this was 2000s business culture. And so this was the people on Ryan's team would kind of come down from the peaks of Mount Shasta to give the ascended knowledge of the lumens Lemurians to us poor folk in the lower creative side. And so it was great, actually, because in a big company, and I've seen this now even with Paizo, like communications is the hardest thing, especially in a creative area. And with gamers, almost all of whom are riddled in some level with insecurities, are always thinking somebody's scheming against them or whatever. So when people are not talking to each other, it is the worst. And so this was an attempt, I assume, to kind of mitigate that. And plus, things were going a million miles an hour. When I got there, it was like, want to play 3rd edition? And I'm like, holy shit, what? You know? And so it was really exciting. And so Ryan and his team were like, and I assume you guys heard about it before, but I hadn't. And it was like, here's what we're going to do, and it's going to be this open thing. And John, you were saying a lot of your friends were like, it's a trap. A lot of people in the building thought it was a trap, too. There were a lot of the designers who were convinced that this was a Machiavellian plan, that Ryan would then be allowed to fire everybody and then hire them as low-paid,
I remember hearing that theory, too.
You know, like it was all a ploy not to pay benefits.
Ryan still gets
Seriously.
that. Like Ryan's CEO of my company.
I'm not saying it wasn't.
He still gets
but
that from
that was kind of the atmosphere that we went into this meeting, and it was really, really interesting because you could see some of the people in the meeting, particularly people that I kind of at the time, rightly or wrongly, associated with kind of old guard, people who've been at TSR for their careers, who were, I think, genuinely worried about it. And then you could see people like Chris Pramus, for example. This was certainly firing in my head. I think Sean was in that meeting. Like, there were people there who were like, oh, this is a way I can continue to make money off of D&D whether I get fired or not. And at Wizards, everybody got fired. I mean, it was just a matter of time before it happened. It was like, what is it, this Christmas or next Christmas? And so, there were definitely the wheels of entrepreneurial spirit turning in that meeting, but there were wheels of terror turning in that meeting as well. So I don't even remember your question. I just really wanted to tell it.
Well, no, actually, it streamlines very well. It's just I'm very interested in this transition from the RPGA's.
Oh yeah. Okay.
To
So
D20.
right. So I was working in the periodicals department, doing Living Greyhawk Journal, which was a short-lived magazine supporting that campaign, doing Polyhedron, and then I think the idea went like this: hey, there's a trillion D&D players, because it's all based on bullshit like pass along readership, and for every group there must be 5 players, so there's 1 billion players. How come there's only 55,000 subscribers to Dragon? How come there's only 14,000 active members in the RPGA when we've convinced ourselves that the industry is this size? And so I think the idea is they started looking at it and said, well, RPGA membership costs $20, and maybe that's a barrier to entry. DCI membership had either started free or gone free fairly recently. So I think the idea was, let's make RPGA membership free. The cost of membership was really to mitigate the cost of producing Polyhedron. Nobody wanted Polyhedron to go away per se. People like me, I guess. So they're like, let's keep that little kid and let's move him over to the periodicals department. And at that stage, it needed to have a broader focus than just what was going on in the RPGA. And the D20 was really, like, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but once the genie got out of the bottle, everybody was making D20 products. It was a huge, overnight thing. It went from nothing to, the G word, glut, very rapidly. And it was also really exciting. So there was a lot of ooh, this is an opportunity. For me, it was an opportunity to cover all of these new products in new companies and old companies that were doing new things that were appealing to an audience that otherwise maybe wouldn't have looked at their stuff. And that was really exciting. It was also very difficult for the average consumer to tell what was absolute garbage and what was good. So there was a critical element that I thought was useful. And then, it was bringing in new people, new freelancers. There was only so many people who could work at Wizards of the Coast. But all of a sudden people like Mike Morrells, who's in charge of D&D now, he's coming up through writing, these little products. And that was really exciting. And the other part of it that I really felt strongly about was the promise of the OGL part of it, and to some degree the D20 license as well, wasn't just, hey, here's a way to make D&D stuff. If you took a bigger view, it was a way to kind of make everything, but to use that kind of common language of D&D to do it. And so one of the things I initiated was every issue of Polyhedron, we'd put in a mini game, and it was like, let's do, Jonathan Tweet came to me and said, I want to do a spin on Gamma World, and Chris Pramus said, I want to do a World War II game, and we worked with a bunch of different people to do these little games, just probably not enough to run a real campaign, but you could play a couple of sessions of a different different flavor. And I thought that was really important to show the breadth of options available through the license. So that's kind of how I shifted over into the D20 world.
Excellent, excellent. And actually, that streamlines really well into to John N here. So, obviously you weren't a pop-up D20 company. You had been around.
Yeah.
And of course, as you mentioned, you had freelanced with TSR in the late '80s, early '90s. Put some great products out there. And really working on competitive products, though, to TSR and then later Wizards was not new to you with Ars Magica and all the things you had worked on.
Yeah, and I always had a relationship with other companies that was very collegial. So, for example, the Over the Edge game that I mentioned earlier was written by Jonathan Tweet. I, at one point, was going to not be able to finish a product I was writing for TSR before having to fly to Europe for a trip, and I set up Jonathan to finish it for me, a book called City of Gold for the Maztica line. And that got his foot in the door. He started doing some freelance stuff for TSR, and then there was the CCG thing. He wound up working at Wizards of the Coast, and lo and behold, he winds up being one of the co-developers, co-designers on third edition. So I had personal relationships with a whole lot of the people that were involved there, and a considerable amount of trust, as well as not the anxiety of worrying that I had a job to lose or anything. But even so, we decided early on to take a chance on this, partly because I had my own designs that I had never gotten around to finishing and stuff. I'm like, this would be really cool. I could publish D&D stuff of my own by myself through my company, and that would be fun.
I mean, it really can't be underestimated what an important signaling function it was for established independent companies in the industry to do open gaming products, right? Mm-hmm. Because like you said, there was a whole lot of people who thought it was a giant trap, and they needed to see real people that they knew taking a risk before they would take that risk.
Yeah.
And
it was, and there also was a cultural stratification in the industry among designers I think it's fair to say that there were some people that looked down on D&D as being the sort of thing. And it was always hard to tell, was it that they really thought that the other games were better than D&D, or was it I can't play in that sandbox anyway, and so I'm going to talk it down. And the D20 system suddenly changed that, and suddenly a whole lot of people came out as D&D lovers that maybe had not presented themselves as such for some time. But I do remember distinctly, we started developing something. We had an adventure that John Tynes, who had previously been a Wizards staffer and had a lot of experience with things like Call of Cthulhu and so forth. He worked up a scenario that was kind of a Tom Clancy thriller thing where you're special ops with crossbows and so forth, going to take out some bad guys. Pretty straightforward. And we had that hashed together. We had gotten somebody, I don't know if it was you, Ryan, or Peter, or Jonathan, somebody sent us a advanced photocopy of the player's handbook when it was at press. So we had something to try to figure out what the rules were, because we had not been part of the design team. It's a little embarrassing looking at the very first printing of 3 Days to Kill, because I think we had some 0-level fighters in there. Some things that didn't actually belong there, but we were winging it. We might have used the 1.0 and not 1.0A license on that thing. But we were really flying by the seat of our pants, because I remember a few weeks before Gen Con cornering Ryan at Origins at a party and saying, "You're really going to do this, man, right? Because I got to go make some print buying purchases and nothing has been finalized." And it was essentially on your somewhat intoxicated handshake that said,
those were the days.
That said, "Yeah, man, it's going to happen." And I said, "Okay, we're going to go ahead and we're going to have something that we're going to put on sale at Gen Con, and we're going to trust that."
Yes, we had the gentleman's agreement.
Yes, no jack-booted thugs are going to bust down our booth and haul us off to. Well, Gitmo wasn't a thing yet, but
no, we wouldn't.
So I think the industry was going through an interesting time right then too, right? So the CCG market has had 3 distinct crashes, right? There was the you can't print money anymore crash. Yeah. Then there was the sort of we've run out of ideas crash, and then there was a sort of a final third crash. And the D20 thing happened during that second crash, right? So there were a bunch of companies who were either coming out of the CCG business or realizing that they were going to need to take a shift to figure out what they were going to do. And the OGL was sort of, once it launched, it was out there for us to sort of latch onto, because money to be made to keep your business the way your business was not coming as easily from the collectible trading card business as it had years prior.
Yep.
And John, actually, as a follow-up to that, it's a great transition to this next question I had for you, which was, you stayed on with Alderac here, and you did you immediately see the opportunity for you here once this license rolled out?
No, he thought it was a total mistake and we were going to completely blow up.
So I did think
He used to call me and say, "Don't do it, Ryan. It's not going to work."
So I went through a few phases. I thought it was nuts. There's no doubt.
You're going to let anybody publish with no limits?
Listen, I thought that was a little bit crazy, and I thought that it was over when White Wolf published that first gigantic book of
Creature
monsters,
collection.
right? Like I thought, okay,
Before the
there's-
Monster Manual.
Yeah, before the Monster Manual, right? Like we were we were actually mad about it, right? Because we were like, well, White Wolf, way to go. You have now destroyed this for everyone. You published a Monster Manual before the Monster Manual came out, and it was a good book, right?
Yeah.
It's a great book.
And so, but the idea was so strong, it just, it stuck around. So I did not, we actually leaped in. We did these, we were talking earlier about, we did these little $2.99
Oh, yeah, I
pocket
remember those.
adventures,
Yeah.
and we built this little.
Those were great.
Cool. They were great, but they were the least profitable SKU you could do under this new license.
It was like a booster pack for a role-playing game.
Yeah.
It was really smart.
You went from that to the world's largest.
We did
Exactly.
we
The
did
alpha
both
and the
ends,
omega.
right? We did the alpha and omega, no doubt.
Well, so speaking of this kind of new opportunity that has now popped up with the OGL, the D20 system, Monty, going back to you, so you finish up your work on 3rd edition, and you clearly identified some opportunity here, spinning off on your own. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like? I mean, perhaps it streams very well with what Eric was talking about, that even people sitting at Wizards said, wow, there's an opportunity for me here, whether I'm here or not.
To some extent, I 3rd edition came out in 2000, and I left Wizards in 2001, and so in that intervening year, I wrote some more D&D stuff. But I also worked on a project. Basically, some people on Ryan's team came to me and they said, if we got a license to do an existing role-playing game, but we converted it to D20, what do you think that should be? And I said, well, it ought to be called Cthulhu, and I ought to write it.
And we said yes.
So so I worked on D20 Call of Cthulhu, and I think it was really that kind of made me realize, there's a lot of stuff that I could be doing with this, and a lot of ways that I could go that probably aren't ways that Wizards wants to go. I'd sort of always looked at my time at TSR and Wizards as a brief 9-year hiatus from freelancing anyway. So I decided to leave Wizards, but because I wasn't totally brave, I left Wizards with a number of freelance contracts with Wizards in my hand for things like the Book of Wild Darkness and a few other things. But then I also contacted people who were already doing D20 stuff, like John, and got freelance work there. And
Beyond the Veil.
Beyond the Veil, yep.
Still available in PDF.
But there was a confluence of laziness and desire to do something, which doesn't make any sense, right? I really wanted to put out my own stuff. I didn't want to be working totally freelance, but I didn't know how to get a product printed. I'd never done anything like that before. So I investigated. Are there other ways? And I found out that there were these things called PDFs, and no one had done a gaming PDF before, but it seemed like the path of least resistance for me, which turned out to be not at all a path of least resistance. But I did that and came out with a book called The Book of Eldritch Might, and that did much better than I thought it was going to. It was kind of a right place at the right time kind of thing. And so that sort of started the whole gaming PDF thing. But it also started Malhavoc Press, which was a company that I did. And once I was able to get Malhavoc Press up and running, I didn't do any more freelance work, and I started exploring some of those ideas that maybe Wizards wouldn't have done that I could do just on my own. And so I did what I called an alternate player's handbook, which was Arcana Unearthed, which was exactly the kind of thing that I think Wizards didn't want anyone to be using the OGL for. It was basically a player's handbook with all different races and classes and everything. Eventually, I guess that led up to one of the final products that I did under Malhavoc Press, which is I took the campaign setting that I had used to playtest 3rd edition, and I published that. And that was called Tulla City of the Spire.
Another $100 product.
120, actually.
Wow. It's pretty clear at this point that this thing comes out not only from the outside. There's pop-up companies, there's established companies that are competitors, and then there's the internal designers that all are seeing a new level of opportunity. So Ryan, I'm going to come back to you, but this is really kind of an all question. So many people credit the OGL with really the resurgence of the post-2000 RPG market. Is that right? Were there other major factors involved, or was this the most important thing that really woke everybody up and got RPGs back on track?
I mean, it's really hard to talk about the counterfactual because we don't live in a world where D&D failed and the industry had to decide what to do next, right? We don't live in that world. My opinion is that the throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at the wall strategy worked. And it did reboot the RPG segment, and it did re-energize people's interest in playing RPGs, but it also reignited the business of selling RPGs, which made it possible for a whole lot of people to become professional RPG designers that wouldn't otherwise have had that opportunity. We can imagine through a glass darkly the counterfactual world where we see things like Ron Edwards innovating with Sorcerer and creating an entirely new approach to how you make role-playing games. Or somebody like Elizabeth Sampat, who made a game called It's Casual, or It's Complicated, who had never played a role-playing game in her life, and she made a role-playing game that looks nothing like any other game you've ever seen. Does White Wolf, in a market that's been cleared of all of its major competitors, stand up and say, "I guess we're going to be the big dog now, and we're going to figure out how to make this work"? I have a hard time imagining that it just all falls apart and there aren't any such things as role-playing games. But it could easily have ended up like the miniatures, historical wargaming market. A very small market with a very small cadre of very dedicated fans, a bunch of products you've never heard of, and innovation that stopped, in 1975. And other than a few things around the edges, really hasn't made much of an advance. That could have happened, right? So when I look back on it, I think that we were, as a fan, somebody who played role-playing games since I was in the 6th grade, I think it worked. Like, we saved the role-playing game business. In saving the business, I think we helped the hobby a tremendous amount, right? Would the hobby have existed without the business? Yeah, I think it would have existed, but I don't think it would be healthy, and I don't think we would have the vast array of products that we now have, that I think, even if they're not derived from the open gaming license, even if they're not trees in that same forest, I think they exist because the business got fixed in that window of time when it needed to get fixed.
So I think it's. Sorry.
No, you go right ahead.
I think it's kind of interesting that Magic the Gathering was sort of pointed to as the thing that was killing Dungeons and Dragons, right? That it was responsible for killing Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah. But I don't think enough people look at the fact that Magic the Gathering made it okay for a gigantic generation of nerds to be nerds,
yep.
Right? And so D&D had a stigma attached to it,
Big
but
time.
Magic did not have
That's right.
that stigma attached to it.
Yep.
And then when we all got to make role-playing game products, we were talking to our customers who had come up through and started with Magic the Gathering, and then they got to discover role-playing game, and it wasn't uncool to do so.
Yep.
You didn't have to hide in your mom's basement to play.
Yep.
I think there are a number, from my perspective, and where our company was at, there are a number of interesting confluences that happened in the early 2000s. We had done a CCG, and like many companies, it had almost killed us. in the first CCG implosion. And literally, I can tell you that the last of the debts that we had incurred from that CCG were paid off by the profits of D20. So we had spent about 4 years. We had a very patient printer and shareholders and so forth that were owed money, and it was the windfall of getting in on that that gave us a foundation that was really tremendously important. And we did not do as much in D20 as a lot of other people. We did not sell as much in D20 as a lot of other people. We also did not risk nearly as much as a lot of other people, partly because we had been through some boom and bust. And I got to the point where I said, I can see where this is going. And so we're not gonna double down on our bets and try to triple our output, because that's not going to be it. We had the sense to be diversifying into other things. But D&D was very satisfying. The D20 and OGL was extremely satisfying for us creatively. It made a huge financial difference for us that put us in a great position for moving into more things like card games. Gloom, for example. Keith Baker, who designed Gloom, we had known him from RPG stuff, but we really did a whole lot of D20 stuff with him, and that was something that enabled him to go into freelancing in the game industry full time. He proposed this wacky thing that became Eberron, and so on, and then became our best-selling game of all time for us, of Gloom and all of its iterations. Another thing that I think is really key about that time in terms of both the business and the creativity is exactly what Monte was talking about, which is electronic publishing. This was something, and I haven't thought about it until we just began to discuss it here, to think of all the implications, but I remember RPG Now and so forth. The rise of that coincided with the rise of OGL and D20 licensing, and it meant that as a platform for publishing RPG material that was disintermediated in a way that had not existed in our industry, that had a radical change. It both made it possible to do things for a much narrower market of something much more specialized, because you didn't have the necessity of printing 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 of a product. You could say, I want to do this thing, and I'm going to be delighted that there are 50 people willing to give me $5 a piece to have a copy of it. And after, I am curious, because I haven't looked closely at it enough, but I'm curious to what extent then that infrastructure of digital distribution that was proven, tested, refined through D20 publication, and both the desire of people to publish and the demand of fans for material, then created an infrastructure that has allowed so many non-OGL, non-D20 indie products to exist in that form, to be developed and redeveloped in that form, and to be a very vibrant part of our industry in a way that was unimaginable 20 years ago. So there's something very interesting going on there too, and in the counterfactual world, does electronic publishing take off without the
It doesn't have enough
license?
volume. It doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah. Does it have the buzz and the legitimacy?
It's very safe to say, I think, that the OGL was a very far-reaching movement, regardless of what we knew, what could have happened and what didn't. One thing we know what happened, Eric, actually brings me to my next question for you. So I guess maybe starting as early as editing Green Ronin's Mutants and Masterminds. Can you talk about specifically that experience and what that game meant to the OGL and kind of where that went?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think back. So in 2000, I was 25 years old, so I'm not even close to 25 anymore. So I'm having now hard time remembering exactly what happened in what order. But there was a whole bunch of things that happened in tight succession, right? Yeah. One of them, and they're just personal experiences essentially. One of them was sort of what Monte was doing with Malhavoc, which was Book of Experimental Might. Did you use the D20 system license, or did you just use the OGL?
Experimental Might?
Yeah, Book of the first one.
Oh,
D20.
Yeah. D20.
Okay, but at what point did you step away from the D20 license?
I had to with Arcana Unearthed.
Right. Okay, so Arcana Unearthed, I can't remember where that fits in with Mutants and Masterminds. It was about the same time.
2003, so it would have been about the same time.
And so there seemed to be a dawning realization among publishers that I feel like Ryan actually had already made a couple of years before, which was one of the upsides of the D20 license as pushed on us in that brand category interface meeting where I remembered was, hey, what this is going to really do is there's all these products with really shitty profit margins like modules and little 32 pagers and stuff like that. Guys, we don't want to be in that business anyway. We want to be in the player's handbook business. We want to be in the Dungeon Master's Guide business and the Monster Manual business. And so let's kind of let everybody else focus on that, who don't need the kind of margins to pay for all the overhead of Wizards of the Coast. And that will fuel the whole system. And I think that the first few guys who got modules out, like, you know, we're like, holy shit, we can make a lot of money on modules. Yeah, this is great. The 35th guy to get a module out started realizing the same things that Wizards and I think even TSR maybe had realized before. There's not a lot of money in modules. And so you start saying, okay, I've got the D20 license, which connotes compatibility with Dungeons and Dragons. But if I publish a thing that looks and smells and sounds like Dungeons & Dragons anyway, everyone's going to know it's a D&D compatible thing, whether it has that D20 license logo on it at all. And at the same time, in my business career, I started going to some of the sales conferences. And I remember specifically talking to one of the main buyers. In fact, it was the main buyer at Alliance. And we were talking, because I was a Polyhedron editor at the time, we were talking about what was coming up with D20 and stuff. And that was the first time that I got a sense that this was going to become a huge problem. Probably the first time was when they closed the Wizards of the Coast stores and they had just shitloads of D&D or of D20 product that was unsellable garbage at that point, right? There's a lot of bad stuff. You take 3 Days to Kill, which was a super innovative module that Wizards would never have published just because of the form and the stuff Monty was doing to experiment with the rules, and then you look at some of the crap that got shoveled out just to make money, and it was gonna burst. And the guy at Alliance looked at me and he's like, I cannot wait to cut all this D20 stuff. We are going to start purging soon. And I thought, oh my God. And you're seeing these other people sort of saying, okay, if we're going to make a core rulebook type product, we don't need the D20 license. All we really need is the OGL. And I don't know 100% how much you anticipated that happening at the beginning. I do remember part of that meeting. Someone said, well, hey, and it turned out to be kind of prophetic, I guess, but someone said, hey, couldn't this OGL mean that someone can just make a better D&D than D&D? And Ryan's like, damn right. That is going to make us not back away from the core principles of what the D&D brand means to so many people. And look, it's all relative, but in my perspective, that's exactly what Wizards did about 5 years later, and left a huge opening for what ultimately became Pathfinder. And other people as well, other things as well. But there was this transition away from the D20 license toward the OGL that I think is actually a really important part of the overall story. And that kind of, the Pathfinder story is actually much, much more complicated than that. But at the moment when Pathfinder transitioned from essentially a series of modules with the Pathfinder Adventure Path, which was doing very well, all of a sudden D&D in 4th edition was not hitting the same funny bone. They had backed away, again, subjectively in my opinion, from some of the things that people valued as part of that D&D experience. And gamers are not an audience that is particularly embracing of change, especially 15 years ago. And so, especially Thursday. So basically, we put out Pathfinder RPG, and we never were going to use the D20 license. And there were certain things you couldn't do if you put that on. And so we knew we had to put out a core rule book or no one was going to buy Pathfinder. Wizards at first was like, oh, we'd love for you to do 4th edition, but it was either a sack of lies or they just changed their plan every 5 minutes. And so we just felt kind of like a jilted lover at that point. And so we're like, okay, so I've got 23 people I'm going to have to lay off because of dilly-dallying from this other company who used to be my friend, and so then we're like, well, look, we got to make a core rule book or no one's going to buy modules for a dead product line. And while we're in there, let's kind of fix up the rules, because we've been editing 3rd edition now for almost 10 years at that point, so we're like, there's some parts of it that could benefit from some improvement. And so we put out that core rule book, and holy shit, there's a lot more money in core rule books than modules. So it was interesting to watch small companies learn the same lessons that I think the big companies that had learned that in some ways engendered the whole license in the first place.
Yep.
That's excellent. Can I, before I go, there's obviously more questions I can ask. Can you give me a show of hands of who's interested in asking a question? I just want to know how much, or you might ask a question. Can we get the mics? At least, okay, I can see a number. All right, so I'm going to short my list a little bit. Again, this is a little bit of an all question, but Ryan, I'm going to start with you again on this one. So the D20 system, it had its detractors. A lot of the old schoolers were big detractors of this thing. I know Gary used to call it the one ring to rule them all, and he basically kind of suggested, like a lot of other people did, you're giving away the cow for free or whatever expression they would use. And it certainly, there was criticisms that I think made some sense. No quality control, D&D not gaining specific recognition when you're buying these products, WotC not gaining the proper licensing income. Mm-hmm. Which of these proved to be valid and which didn't matter? I guess that's kind of what I'm looking at.
Well, I'll tell you, from Wizards' perspective, I don't think any of them really mattered. There's a theory inside Wizards of the Coast that if you have the market share leading product in the category of games, any and all activity in that category of games will eventually benefit you. So having the market share leader in trading card games meant that all of the activity in trading card games eventually sold more Magic. And the theory was that all the activity that would take place in role-playing games would eventually result in selling more Dungeons & Dragons. So it's not necessarily the rising tide lifts all boat theory, it's the rising tide lifts one boat. And if you own that boat, you're really in good shape. So sales of 3rd edition were very good. Sales of 3.5 were very good. And they significantly exceeded the optimistic projections of my team, and my optimistic projections were way above the projections of the rest of the business managers at Wizards of the Coast. So just looking at the numbers, it's hard to argue that anything really went wrong. Can you ascribe all of that to the OGL? No, you just can't, because we had the throw the whole thing at the wall, including the kitchen sink strategy. When the blowback came on the quote-unquote glut of D20 products, brands hold value in markets that are declining. And so Dungeons & Dragons as a mark of quality and a safe haven that you could go back to if you felt like you had been burned on a bunch of crap product in the marketplace was a place that people put their dollars in, right? So when they started to move away from third-party D20 products, there was always Wizards of the Coast standing there with really high-quality D&D products that you could safely buy and know were well-designed and would be a really good addition to your library. I certainly think that there was a period of time where people got burned out on buying and then playing RPGs because they just had so much content. But we had kind of reignited the market and re-strengthened the social network to the point where it was healthy enough to survive the commercial hit of a bunch of people going out of business. The players, the people who were forming groups and playing games were still there. And you can't write a business plan that says, and then a miracle occurs. But that is exactly what happened to Paizo, right? They had a very good reputation of quality products in a market that was in decline because of low quality products, and the market share leader shit the bed. So they're standing there saying, we're still doing the thing that you love, and you trust us, and you've known us for 50 years, or you've known us for 20 years, just come on over to our house and play. And the market just shifted. So Wizards of the Coast takes a big hit because their business moves, right? But Paizo benefits from all the third-party activity of D20, right? So there's this weird once-in-a-lifetime value transition from one company to another. Certainly benefits Paizo. It's hard to say that it didn't, right?
But
Green Ronin publishes some amazing OGL/D20 products. They get a benefit because they're a very high-quality brand. Monty's got his stuff out there. It's got a very high-quality brand. Like companies that built brands benefited when the crash came, when the trash got flushed, right? They were there to pick up the pieces, and some of those companies are still around today and still doing quite well, or they've morphed into different things. Even if they're not doing what they were doing back then, they're doing what they're doing because of what they did back then. Yeah,
that's great. John, you want
Pathfinder became Pepsi, right? It was the Coke to the Pepsi, but
Right on.
yeah, and then Pepsi decided to do like new Coke and not switch, not go back to Coke Classic.
But it didn't kill Coke, right? I mean,
Yeah.
but it did make them like the Ryan Dancey strategy of, well, if we're not awesome, this can come back to kill
Yes,
us, but we
yes.
are going to be awesome, so I don't even know why we're having this conversation.
Right.
They
We're
have
Wizards
now,
of the Coast. How could we ever screw it up? Yeah.
You know, Ryan, you lighted on something really interesting there that I certainly hadn't thought of, which is, you know, I think you could say a lot about 4th edition. Wizards rolls out the GSL, the more restricted GSL, that kind of basically takes the OGL and really puts some restriction on it that don't make it the OGL anymore.
Yeah.
But you lighted on something that was very interesting, that Wizards was the gold standard though, right? If you needed quality, you already had the D20 crash.
Yep.
So was Wizards as crazy as maybe it's easy in hindsight to look and say, were they as crazy as we think they were to do that 4th edition switch?
No, they absolutely were not. I think there's a lot of good strategy behind 4th edition. If you just looked at 4th edition completely in isolation from the rest of the market, I think there is a lot of smart decisions that were made there. And the product is very good. Like, the design of that game is excellent. I would never trash 4th edition as a game designer, as a product. They did great work. They just went a place where there wasn't a market to go into, right? And they didn't realize that they had done that until it was too late to course correct. They made a really good analysis, which is that MMOs are eating our lunch, right? This whole new category of product appeared, grew from nothing to an enormous business, and was changing fundamentally the kinds of people that played role-playing games. There's a whole class of people that used to be in role-playing game tables that aren't there anymore, because the thing that they want out of a gaming experience they get from MMOs way better than they get from a tabletop RPG. And Wizards tried to design a game that would bring those people back to the table and would be something that would stand aside an MMO experience and say, this is how you do this on the tabletop, it's really cool. So if I was just looking purely at it as a business case, I would say, you know, they identified they had a huge problem, they smartly came up with a strategy to address it, they executed that strategy very well, and then it totally failed. Right? So they did everything right, except they didn't actually make any money at the end.
And if not for Paizo, who knows, right? Going back to that, I mean, Paizo's not there ready to collect the 3.5
Yeah, well, I don't
market.
know what would have happened.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah. You know, is there another company behind Paizo? Maybe. Who knows, right? We don't live in that world.
So before we move on to the audience Q&A, there's obviously a lot of interest there. I wanted to give at least each of you a chance to tell us about what you're working on now before we can open the floor. John, you want to start?
I'm working on 6th edition
Coming out next year.
OGL. No, AEG has shifted into doing board games and boxed games. We just did a giant Kickstarter for a game called Thunderstone, which was ultimately inspired by our love of Dungeons and Dragons and dungeon crawling. So, we're sort of out of the role playing game business and into the boxed game business. It's exciting and fun.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, I don't have anything to do with role-playing games anymore. Yeah, I ran a company called Goblinworks that created Pathfinder Online. We wanted to make an MMO based in the Pathfinder world, and spent 5 years of my life on that, and then made a transition out of that. Now I'm working with John.
Pathfinder continues to go strong. We have, as soon as I'm done here, I'm going back to my hotel room and putting the last 100 words into an article that I have to send back to home for Pathfinder number 125, which is a bit of a milestone, because I remember when Lisa, kind of, John, what you were saying, when you called Ryan and said, you're really doing this, right? When we decided to do Pathfinder Adventure Path after we didn't get a renewal on the magazine license that we'd been doing for Dungeon and Dragon, I said, okay, Lisa, you have to promise me that we're going to at least publish the first 6 volumes of this, because if we never finish Rise of the Rune Lords, we will be hounded by players until our dying days about how it ended and how could we possibly leave something done. And she, sweated a little bit and said, well, let me look at the number. Okay, I think I can commit. We'll do at least 6 months of Pathfinder. So we're at number 125, which is great. And then this year here at the show, we launched a new OGL-based game called Starfinder, which is kind of the culmination of something I, as a kid, always wanted, which was, a science fiction spin on a game system that I was familiar with and already liked. We brought more copies of that than any product we've ever sold over 4 days of Gen Con, and we sold all of them in 6.5 hours. So that's pretty cool.
Like I said, I had a company called Malhavoc Press, and when I knew that I wanted to start doing a completely different game, I realized that Malhavoc Press was so closely associated with D20 and the OGL that I basically created an entirely different company called Monte Cook Games. And that is sort of built on the back of a game called Numenera, which we launched 5 years ago. And We have since just published our 100th product, or added our 100th product to the catalog. We've got a staff of nine full-time people and about 4 part-time people, and things are going very, very well for us.
We primarily are known now, I think, for our card games and increasingly some things in the board game space, and so that's the bulk of our business, and that some of that predates the D20 stuff, going back to Lunch Money and Once Upon a Time and so forth. On the role-playing field, what we've been doing recently, we find the market for us is a tough one in traditional distribution for role-playing, and some of it just because of the diversity of stuff that's out there. And we've found that crowdfunding is the best way to get to the fans for us on launching a new product and meeting the standards of the marketplace in terms of production values and things like that. So most recently what we have here is the 3rd edition of Unknown Armies, which is this full-color 3-part thing that had a magnetic slipcase and stuff like that. D20 is certainly not dead. I can tell you, for example, my wife, at her bedside table is her stack of Stargate D20 books, because she is preparing to run a campaign of that for the 2nd time with her weekly game group, and so she has been over the last few weeks enthusiastically rereading her collection of old Stargate D20 books, which she was very upset she was going to have to go buy them again because she couldn't find them, and then I discovered that she had just misalphabetized them on the enormous D20 book case. So some of that work, and that's the great thing, right? Is that we can happily continue to play our blue or red box D&D games, as well as licenses that long ago ceased to exist, as far as contracts and so on. So that's pretty neat still as a gamer.
Thank you. Well, we still have quite a bit of time left, so folks, let's see some questions. Yes, sir. Oh, you in the hat? Yes.
First, I want to say thanks to you guys for the work on the OGL. It's like I've just seen it. Yeah. I think a lot of people here can attest to the fact that it's made lifelong, life-changing connections and experiences much easier to have. One of the things that fascinated me the most about what you guys were saying was kind of the older, almost manufacturing mindset of making a product so good you put yourself out of business. And I'd be interested to hear from all of you on how you strike the balance between now, in your current spheres of influence, innovating without alienating, like you said, people who are averse to change, but continuing that mindset of rejecting like the manufacturing went the way of proprietary BS, to where you need a special screwdriver for everything, or you need to order the manufacturer-specific parts, and the OGL flies in the face of that entire mentality. So I'd like to hear more about how you guys are currently not innovating yourself out of business, but also not innovating your solid base in a way as well.
You got an answer for that?
Yeah, I think you might have an answer for it. I think that when we have done our worst, we've done this for 25 years, and I think that when we've had our worst times, we were operating from a place of fear of losing the thing that we have succeeded with. Most of the time, when we've succeeded the most, we are operating from a position of the kitchen sink situation, right? Where we are, like, the only fear we have is failure, and there is no fear of losing anything and protecting the creativity of what we're doing. So, the answer for us is that we try to wake up every day and say, don't have fear about making great things. Great products will always find a customer base, even if they're different. People will move to that light. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, a creative industry is a weird kind of beast, because you're looking at it from a business perspective, but you're also looking at it from a creative one, and it just simply, if you've created something so great that everyone loves it, and no one wants to switch from that because they're very happy with that, it just simply behooves you to think up the next thing, right? Which is also going to be just as awesome.
Something I'd add to those thoughts is that some of the way that I've thought about role-playing games has certainly changed in the last couple of decades. One of them is I take it as a given the forking and the splintering, and I remember a lot of industry discussions about this with the potential impact of the OGL with development forks and so on. And I think that that's just a fact of reality. I mean, people do their homebrew. They always do their homebrew. And so in terms of role-playing publishing, I'm not worried about backward compatibility if I'm doing a new edition. I want to do something that's new and different and that may be completely radically incompatible because we now have electronic publishing, which means that somebody who wants to buy a 30-year-old incarnation of a rule set because that's what they're comfortable with, go to town, man. I'm still selling them. And I got no inventory cost. And so I think that is an element that is liberating in a way that maybe is a different dynamic than what it was in the year 2000 when there was a lot more concern about, do we need to fire our fans of the old edition and force them all to convert to the new and stuff like that. And so I think that that's something that's still evolving and changing the ways that designers are thinking about stuff.
I agree with everything. I think innovation is actually really, really important. If only just to keep yourself interested in what you're doing. I think when Paizo has been at its worst, it's been when we've just gotten complacent and when we've just kind of said, oh, yep, let's get out this month's product and then there's next month's product, and not really thinking about how what we're doing is going to light a fire as much as how it's going to deliver the revenue that it needs just to get us through that month. And so, I had a moment where we did Pathfinder 100. I was talking about 125, but we did 100 a couple of years ago, and it was a big deal for us internally because, we still think in many ways of ourselves as a magazine company, and to reach 100 issues of a magazine is a huge deal. I mean, very few people can say that they've done that. And so we were very filled with like a self-congratulatory spirit. We were all super excited. We did a big oversized issue. We called back authors from every adventure path, and that's 15 adventure paths at that point, to do a special article revisiting their adventure path. I wrote this, I don't get to write that much anymore, so it's kind of a big deal for me. No one else cares, but I'm like, oh, I wrote an article, and it was all about this mysterious god that people have been asking about forever. And so like we kind of put our A game into Pathfinder 100 thinking like everyone's going to really be excited, and no one gave a shit. It was just like, okay, this month's Pathfinder, and like the media didn't care, and I started kind of see where it's like no matter how good we feel like what we're doing by iterating the same thing the 100th time, people, it's not that they don't like it or that they don't care, it's just not special to them anymore. They're not excited. And so that was the day I decided to do Starfinder, actually, was when I realized no one cared about Pathfinder 100. And because we were always going to do it eventually, and I said, why not do it right now? We have to make a splash. We have to do something interesting and the stuff that's most interesting to the players. I think if you're people who are interested, and we're all gamers at Paizo, and I think everyone at all of our companies are gamers. So if we're excited about something, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to succeed, but it does mean it's got a much better chance of kind of igniting the excitement of other people. And when we're just doing something to do it, no one gives a crap.
Next question. You and then all the way in the back. So the close, yes, and then.
Hi. I was wondering what you thought if there were any social factors that helped with the rise of D20 and OGL. To know specifically from the gaming group I'm in, my buddy here. The core of us have been gaming together now since 2001, and a big impetus for us was when 3.0 came out. But not just 3.0, it was 2001, and Fellowship of the Rings had just come out, which really ignited the kind of the fantasy. Hey, none of us had really sat down and done RPGs in a while, really got a group together that stayed together. And one of our tenets has always been, when you're gaming, do whatever would cost the most in special effects. Right, think of it as a movie. What would cost the most? Okay, I'm going to try and do that. And we do that. So I really think if that atmosphere, and almost specifically the Lord of the Rings movies, helped with that rise of the D20.
Certainly, when I talk with people about the success of 3rd edition, and I think this is absolutely carried over to the OGL in general, there are certainly some really major cultural things that were going on completely out of anyone else's control. And the Lord of the Rings movies is a big one. But that right around the launch of third edition, right in the time period we're talking about, is also about the time when people like us suddenly ended up in the writers' rooms of television shows and writing movie scripts and everything. And so
Some actors.
yeah. And so there was this cultural shift. You know, D&D had its troubled past as far as the culture at large goes. But once we hit about the year 2000, all of a sudden, you know, oh yeah, D&D, I did that. That was cool, right? Oh, I learned a lot of stuff, you know. And suddenly it was maybe it wasn't cool, but it didn't have the stigma that it had. And so we started to see it pop up into culture all over the place. And I think that that's a really big deal. And I think there's another aspect to it, and that is, again, people like us right around that time who were kids when the first D&D boom happened in the 80s. We're now all at about the right age that we had kids who were about at the right age to start playing games. And so they were walking into game stores saying, hey, when I was a kid, I played D&D. I want to introduce my kid to this. What do you got for me? And they said, oh, it just happens we have this new edition.
So I would say there was actually some behind-the-scenes stuff that most people aren't really aware of that had a big impact. So Wizards of the Coast had always been a fairly early adopter of the internet, and the industry professionals had embraced internet stuff relatively early. AOL had this TSR-themed chat room thing, and actually Jim Butler still has the AOL Jim username all these years later. So I operated two mailing lists. One was called OGL-L, and the other was called D20L. And they were designed to allow the publishers to communicate with the people inside Wizards of the Coast about how the licenses were going to work and how the content would be distributed, and to answer legal questions and like all this stuff that kind of had to happen, this penumbra of activities that were going on behind the scenes before any of the first products could be published. John and I were joking in Monty about this gentleman's agreement, which, like Eric says, we would never call a gentleman's agreement today. That was not to see. Yes. We were staging things, so we showed people the license to get feedback, and then we showed them parts of the SRD to get feedback, but we hadn't published the book yet. And so there was a certain element of like, we don't want to have the rules of third edition spoiled before we ship the product, so as a gentle person's agreement, we'll share things with certain publishers. And then we had this thing, Eric Noah creates this website.
Right.
That is like a rumor site, and now they're everywhere, right? There's like a Star Wars rumor site and a Thor rumor. Everything in gaming has everything in the genre of anything that's in San Diego Comic-Con. There's a rumor site for it, right? But we had never seen anything really like it before. And on the brand team side, we were kind of challenged, like, what do we do about this? Do we want to go to this guy and say, knock this off, we don't like this? Well, our whole strategy was about being open and transparent. And so we're like, okay, there's a guy who's going to collect every scrap of rumor and innuendo from anywhere he can get it and publish it in the front page of this website. And apparently a whole lot of people are going to read it every day and then ask us questions. We should just go with it and start feeding him stuff and telling him when he's got his facts wrong and getting him insider information. And I mean, EN World is still running today. It's incredibly popular. They got the EN Awards here at Gen Con, right? So this kind of behind the scenes plumbing of the internet happened because the internet happened. Like, it was Web 1.0, and it went from being a thing where you paid $6 a minute for dial-up access to, $20 a month for unlimited access. All that happened right at the same time we were doing what we were doing, and it absolutely influenced our ability to make the OGL happen.
Can I add on to
Yeah.
that? Is it? I don't think you can sing Eric Noah's praises highly enough in this context. Honestly, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that looking at, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but in the atmosphere of '98 to 2000 or so, I would say. There was like not a lot of places you could go to kind of wear your D&D shirt and kind of pump your chest. You'd go on to RPGNet, and that was the hive of like, Dungeons and Dragons, like
That was where companies like mine,
It's like,
our games,
your game,
our RPGNet darlings, like Unknown Armies.
your game uses dice, like that kind of a thing, and then you had communities like TSR's AOL thing, which were like totally like a gate locked.
Yeah.
You know, and so if you were on AOL, you could have a great little thing, but if you weren't, you had no access to that content whatsoever. And so I think all of a sudden, with all the exciting news about, oh, you know, I hear they're bringing the Barbarian back or whatever, you're checking EN World or Eric Noah's D&D rumor site every single day. You know, and even within at Wizards, we would check it every day, and it'd be like, anonymous says this thing, and it's like, that's fucking Ryan. And so like we and even going back a little bit further, I think there's also a professional element that's really important. You know, when I started editing Polyhedron in 1999, we were still getting snail mail letters. By the time I was editing Dungeon Magazine in 2003, the only snail mail letters that we got were from prisoners, because they are the only people who couldn't send emails. And that's why I changed the name of the letter column of Dungeon to Prison Mail, because literally that's the only mail we got. And so that transition, I mean, the only reason that I got hired was because of connections that I made through the AOL. You know, like Sean Reynolds hired me as a TSRO, you know, like a moderator guy, and I was like a know-it-all Greyhawk nerd. You know, that if there wasn't the internet, I would have just been some guy writing a manifesto in his closet. You know,
That's how I had to start.
Yeah, and all of a sudden, as a magazine editor, I wasn't throttled by the 6 or 7, you know, snail-mailed proposals I got. I'm getting hundreds of proposals, you know, from the internet, and I'm meeting people like Merles and other folks, and all of a sudden there's this connectivity and this community that I think previously were these islands in little different companies, and everyone got to meet at Gen Con, and they're all friends because they, you know, work from one place to the other. But all of a sudden there's this community of fans and fans who became pros. And, you know, I mean, I remember hearing from people when I joined the staff at Wizards that when they joined the staff at TSR, for example, there weren't a lot of games going on. People were tired and they didn't want to play games and stuff. And then you have this infusion of people who come up into the industry through the internet largely, who are fanatical about gaming. And you'd see games at Wizards, you couldn't get a seat in a conference room after 6 p.m. because there's games running every night, you know? So a very different environment, and I think the internet had everything to do with that.
There's a bit of weirdness too, where before the internet connecting people to groups, you have stuff like, well, everybody I know
Yeah.
plays this game. It's like, well, yeah, there's 7 people in your town. But now we realize, oh, that's just one small group.
We used to, as Greyhawk fans, for example, we would take pride that our conversations on AOL dominated more folders than any other one, right? Because I think that we were always like thinking that the TSR people were like, well, no one plays Greyhawk, but then all of a sudden all these, you know, 20s and early 30s people are getting online who started in 83, 84, 82, the big boom when Greyhawk was the campaign setting, and it's like, wait, there's other people who like Greyhawk? I thought Greyhawk was dead. And so you a lot of groupthink, I think, couldn't help but evaporate in the face of, oh, there's other people like me out there.
When I start,
People always say, well, this is different now. Why? I said, the internet changes the world.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering from a games perspective, when it comes to realm of MMOs where, oh man, the cleric is the most powerful character in the game, but we'll nerf him this week. From a game designers that have physical publishing, have you ever like had to wrestle with that? Like, oh man, this character is broken, well, it's in print, I can't change it now.
Yeah, all the time. Right. Now you just update the PDF.
Start making a role-playing game that's strictly digital. That way you can change it on the fly.
Well, there's a lot of role-playing games that are strictly digital these days, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yep, it's always a problem.
Broken is fun. If it wasn't fun, you guys wouldn't continue to do it to everything we make. Right?
You had another comment, and then in the back I had you queued up before. Did you want to finish your?
Oh, I was just going to say really quickly that before the internet, customers couldn't talk directly to a publisher, and so their information would come from a retail store, and often a retail store would get bad information from the distributor. It's like, oh, that game's out of print now. It's like, no, we've got 3 more products coming out in the next 6 months. So,
That still happens.
have a.
When I started in the industry, I started a little company called Iron Crown Enterprises, and at the back of every single product, we would print a page. It would be a questionnaire that people would fill out to tell us what they thought of this, and we expected them to, tear it out, or maybe if they found a photocopy machine, photocopy it, right? Put it in the mail, put a stamp on it, and send it in. Well, as you can imagine, every product we got maybe one, right? But that was the feedback that we got, and so we used it, right? And now compare
People
that.
hate elves.
People compare that to now, right? Where you almost get far more feedback than you really want.
Often before something's published.
Yes.
Exactly. Yes, sir. In the very back, what we queued up earlier.
Kind of a two-part question, but I was wondering, like, as Monte Cook and some of you were making different products. Some of you are making different products during this OGL phase, but really specifically 3.0, specifically Mr. Cook. Did you feel any of that pressure that you were really revitalizing the entire industry at that point, or was that kind of like behind the curtain and seeing it? And then on the other side, for Ryan, how did Where's the Coast keep from ruining the product out of fear?
I didn't quite hear the end of it. How do we keep from what?
Ruining the product. For example, you've got something that if you fail, it might destroy everything.
Yeah.
But how did that fear of not keep Wizards from just like gripping it too tightly like we've seen on
Being paralyzed.
Well, I have the unique attribute of being unbelievably arrogant. And I have self-confidence of 18 plus. And so I never doubted for a moment that we were going to have the most successful version of Dungeons and Dragons. So I really didn't have to plan for what would happen if it didn't work. And I will tell you that it's the honest truth.
We also had, at least at that time, the largest playtest of a role-playing game that had ever been done, right? And it was also the first time anyone had ever done actual real market research on the role-playing game.
We had lots of data.
Only time.
By the way, we'll still cite that.
And so there, we kind of knew.
Yeah, I was very confident.
We
had
had
good
reason to be
data.
confident, I guess. But that it is absolutely true. And honestly, I can't remember if it was you, Ryan, or if it was Peter. But someone came to us and said, "No pressure, but if you guys fail, everything collapses." Right?
Sounds like something I would have said.
It does sound like something that you would have said.
Hey,
Yes.
Brian, did you want to chime in on
Yeah,
that?
if you wouldn't mind. So, I was in the executive meetings with Ryan when we were going through all this, and we're always a product of where we come from. I came from Detroit in the 80s, which went through hell, right? Because the Japanese ate our lunch. And I was a firm believer that innovation begets success at the end of the day. And there are definitely members on the executive team that did not buy into that, but Ryan's strategy took down two barriers to competition. One was, or two barriers to success. One was for the smaller publishers, now they have the framework of a house set out that they could build upon without any capital expense in development. So that is a heuristic of rules, right? And I, as a lawyer, knew we can't protect that.
Yeah, right.
That's the dirty little
We couldn't
secret.
have. Anyway.
And so the sort of the genius was, I had been stewing on this mechanic of shrink wrap licenses, which was also a product of the times, and I wanted to put it on Magic because I thought there was some really cool ways we could use it on Magic, and nobody bought into that. But Ryan found an amazing way to adapt it to Dungeons and Dragons, and he takes this barrier away from the small publisher. And they fill in so much of the market with the products that were hard for us to produce. At the same time, he takes a barrier away from the consumer. Everybody in every small town now knows and operates on one framework of rules. I can't protect it legally anyways. I can't sue anybody over that.
Yep.
But now I've got a license that lets everybody participate, and Wizards, so long as we're smart, and as Ryan brought up in the executive meeting, it's going to make us innovative, right? You got to have some courage to embark on that, yes, there were naysayers, but there was enough people that had been trained in sort of Six Sigma systems that says, look, if we don't innovate and be great, we're dead anyways. And so we all set sail on that trip together.
Yep.
And it was a brilliant strategy. And I think it did make it so much better for the consumer to be able to participate and you could find a niche product for anything. I knew there was a guy from Wizards that made very adult content role-playing games. And
The book of erotics, something or other.
that, right? There was always a strategy. If you know your market really well, you'll make a product that works for that.
Yeah.
And it did.
So we thought that one was going to kill the deal too. Like we were like, okay, this is
That
the
one may have
bridge
killed
too
Anthony.
Killed
far.
the trademark
Yeah.
license.
It-
Like,
it-
I think
it
they
seemed
revised
like-
the trademark license after that.
It seemed like part of the question was, did we understand what was going on and what it meant in many ways? And the answer, I think, is yes. I mean, we
We were very upfront about it.
Yeah, I still have thousands I'm sure in my email archives of the
Yeah.
discussions about the implications of one thing and another.
Yeah.
Something that I particularly appreciate about this, Brian's comment about, well, you can't stop them anyway, is there is something about role-playing games in particular that is very peculiar as a creative endeavor. As it happens, my wife, Michelle, who for Atlas deserves really almost the lion's share of the credit for what we did with D20, with her work as an editor. She was working on her dissertation at the same time as doing the D20 editing. She stopped her adjunct teaching to become a full-time editor managing the D20 products, and then moved into the card games and so forth. And she wrote her dissertation on role-playing games. And Lovecraft and the Lovecraft Circle, and what Lovecraft had done in terms of inviting other writers into his world to develop the Cthulhu mythos, and correlating that to how role-playing games invite multiple creators and invite a creative relationship between the GM and the players, and between the GM and the creator of the game, and so forth. And we have this immense, amazing, astonishing hobby that modern American copyright law is completely inadequate to deal with, because all of the things that make it great and make it wonderful as a fan activity and collaboration give hives to corporate lawyers and IP specialists, because that's all about building walls and monetizing things. And what we do, both as fans and as creators and as publishers, is we break down walls. We smash up things, right, John? And we mash it all together to do something that's wonderful and different and creative. And the OGL fundamentally is how can we cut through the bullshit?
Yeah.
And let us do what we all are doing.
Yeah.
And we only stop doing it when someone says, hey, wait a minute, is this okay? And then someone says, I'm not sure if this is okay.
That is not okay.
Maybe we shouldn't do it. And then they stop doing it, and that inhibits them, and then they have less fun,
Yeah.
and they go and do something else instead, like join some raid in an MMO.
Yeah.
But so I think we knew that was a problem that we were all wrestling with, and the leadership that the OGL provided was one way of addressing that problem, where copyright law still is behind the times. And I think in a lot of other creative fields, it remains behind the times in finding the ways to deal with fanfic and all kinds of stuff like that. But
I think we wake up every day.
our business, we figured it out.
Yeah, I think we wake up every day and we're amazed that there's 60,000 people at Gen Con this year, right?
Oh, my
and
Lord.
we are all riding this wave and are honored to have been part of the wave. But after you are excited to be a part of the wave, you also wake up and realize that the things that you're doing now are the things that are going to keep that wave growing and keep bringing new people into our industry. And it's a big responsibility.
Well, folks, we are out of time. I hope you enjoy this panel. Please, let's give a huge hand to our panelists. And others like Ryan Lewis, who worked at the OGL.